This weekend we are celebrating our second grade class because they're receiving their first communion tomorrow morning. So this is going to be you'll get to see the sneak peek of the first communion homily because I didn't bother to write two of them. But anyways, speaking of first communion, I first knew that God was calling me to be a priest right around the time of my first communion in second grade. And so the Eucharist was always a major reason why I felt called to be a priest. And I remember leading up to my ordination, I was really looking forward to my first Mass, obviously, right? There's a lot of anticipation, there's a little bit of nervousness. You don't want to mess things up the first time. And I remember during that Mass holding bread in my hands on that day, Sunday, May 30th, 2010, about 3:30 in the afternoon, and saying the words, "This is my body." And I remember how it felt. And it felt the exact same as the dozens and dozens of times that I'd practiced saying the Mass in my dorm room, getting ready for that day. It didn't feel any different. And I remember it felt, as if, for a second I felt like I was pretending to be a priest. And since that May afternoon, 15 years ago, I have offered nearly 7,000 more Masses, and I can, in those 7,000 Masses, count on probably one hand the number of times that I felt anything when I offered the Mass, when I said those words, "This is my body." And, that's okay, because our faith is not about feeling something. Feelings are temporary. Why would God ever base our entire faith on a temporary thing? Feelings can come and they can go, but God is eternal and constant and forever. He's there even when we don't think of him. He's there even when we don't feel him. And so in a few minutes, we will receive communion. In a few hours, our second graders will receive their first communion. And for us and for them, it will probably taste like normal unleavened bread. It won't taste any different, but we know that it's different, and we're sure about this because Jesus says so. "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. I am the living bread came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever, and the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh." Now, there's plenty of non-Catholics who will tell you that, Jesus is speaking in metaphor here. That when he says bread and when he says flesh, what he really means is those who consume my word or live in my word will have eternal life. And I don't know about you, but that's a lot of twisting Jesus' words to me, kind of putting words in Jesus' mouth. But if you simply read the words and you take Jesus at face value, the words that he says, then you would have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to come to any other conclusion than Jesus, what he actually means, what he's actually saying. So either Jesus is a liar, or he's crazy, or he's saying that he wants us to eat his flesh. And people who hear Jesus, they react appropriately, right? They say, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" And they're confused. And Jesus doesn't stop them in their confusion. He doubles down. He says, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For indeed my flesh is food, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." He's not just saying these sort of things to be provocative and to grab their attention, because he never corrects himself. St. John's Gospel says that many people left Jesus when he said these words. They stopped following Jesus that very day because they simply could not accept what he was saying. John's Gospel records their response. They say, "Master, this is a hard teaching," and they leave. And I agree with them. If I was hearing this for the first time, I would have a hard time believing it too. But notice at no point does Jesus try to stop them from leaving. And in fact, he turns to his disciples and his 12 apostles and he's like, "Are you guys going to leave too, since everybody else is leaving?" And Peter steps up and he says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. The crowds left him because they understood him perfectly well. But the apostles stayed because even though they didn't understand how, they knew that Jesus meant something more. If you've ever gone to to Eucharistic adoration, you've no doubt heard the song O Salutaris and the song Tantum Ergo. These songs about the Eucharist were written by St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas famously spent most of his life writing comprehensive books that explained and defended the Catholic faith. And my entire undergraduate degree in liberal arts, specializing in philosophy, was based almost entirely off of his writings. So I've got a little bit of love and respect for him. But the most impactful thing to me that St. Thomas ever did is that one day in prayer, in a state of religious ecstasy, he was given a vision. And in this vision, God gave him the slightest glimpse of heaven. For a second, God removed the veil of bread and wine, and St. Thomas saw the truth. And he understood then that the reason that God uses the veils of bread and wine is that if we actually beheld the truth of what we receive in communion face to face, we would die out of love. We would die out of being loved. I had a professor in the seminary, Father Bob Pisarczyk, who's like 5.5 foot tall Polish dude with white hair, pumped a lot of iron, drank too much scotch, but he was a great teacher. He taught us our class on the Eucharist. And he said that the best way that he could describe the Eucharist is that each host, each piece of consecrated bread is a portal, it's a window into heaven that puts us into the presence of the divine. So what do you do when you're a guy like St. Thomas Aquinas and you've experienced something like St. Thomas Aquinas experienced? Well, here's what he did. He put down his books, and he never wrote another word on defending the faith or doctrine. And in fact, he said, all that I have written is straw. Everything I've written up to this point is pointless in the face of the true mystery. And what he did with the rest of his life is he wrote hymns about the Eucharist, which tells you quite a bit about what he actually saw. In his hymn Tantum Ergo, he writes, "Faith will tell us Christ is present when our human senses fail." And that's a reference to our understanding of the real presence, that Jesus is in the Eucharist, present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, under the appearances of bread and wine. The Eucharist is not just a symbol or a figure of speech, but the actual living, real presence of Christ. And that our senses perceive the outward appearances of bread and wine, but our faith tells us that it is Jesus himself. But just because we have an explanation and doctrine that we're required to believe as Catholics, it doesn't make it easier, right? And as I said in the beginning, at times, perhaps even most of the time, it's difficult to feel Jesus present in the Eucharist. Sometimes most of the time I feel like I'm just holding bread in my hands. And it's often difficult to see how the Eucharist is changing us and impacting us and affecting us. And so tomorrow morning when I talk to the second grade class, I'm going to tell them this story to illustrate the effect that the Eucharist has on us. And you've all heard it before, but I've been here for 9 years. I've only got so many stories. So, but this is what I want the second graders to remember. So I'm the oldest of 5 boys and 2 girls. And after my first year in the seminary, so this would have been the summer of 2004, our whole family went to my mother's oldest sister, Aunt Marcy's house in San Bernardino, California. And we did all of the, Americana family road trip type things, the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains, theme parks, things like that. And we decided that on one of the days we were at Aunt Marcy's house in Southern California, we would go to the beach. So we didn't have too many of those in Nebraska. And when I was going to school on the East Coast, we would go to the Jersey Shore for Thanksgiving each year. We knew a family that lent us their summer house. And the water on the East Coast comes up from the Caribbean. So, even in late November, you can go swimming in the Atlantic Ocean. It's like a bathtub. But that day on the beach in California was beautiful. The Pacific Ocean is cool all year round because that water comes down from Alaska. And there was a perfect breeze coming off the ocean. It made a summer day in Southern California feel like spring. And on top of that, in addition to the breeze and the nice temperatures, there were a few clouds to keep the sun off our backs. And so it was perfect. We had a picnic lunch. We played in 6-foot waves all afternoon. And of course, I was pretty tired after all that. And so I laid down in the sand on my stomach. And before I fell asleep, the last thing I heard was the voice of my mother who said, "Put some sunscreen on." And when I woke up, it no longer felt like a cloudy, cool, breezy day. I realized that Southern California we didn't bake like we do in Southwest Nebraska. It's a crock pot instead, and you cook slowly and thoroughly. And so by the time that we got back to Aunt Marcy's house, my back and my legs were covered in blisters, and I was breaking out in shivers. I had a fever, and that night, the only way that I could get to sleep to kill some of the pain was Aunt Marcy gave me some of her Vicodin that she took for arthritis. But so what does any of this have to do with the Eucharist? Well, here's the part that I want the second graders to remember, so you might as well remember it too. When you're laying on the beach on a cool, cloudy day, it doesn't feel like anything is happening. When we receive Jesus in the Eucharist, it might not feel like anything is happening. But in actuality, something remarkable is happening. We might not see what is happening to us right away, but it's happening nonetheless. And to state that the Eucharist doesn't do anything would be just as ridiculous to say that the sun can't do anything to our skin when we don't wear sunscreen. So what is it that actually happens to us when we receive the Eucharist? There's no way to, adequately portray that. But simply put, when you receive communion, you become more united to Jesus. More united in a way that you cannot get any closer to him on this side of eternity. We literally have his presence flowing through our veins. There's a saint, St. Athanasius, who was one of the church fathers. He lived in the 4th century. And he famously said, "God became man so that man could become God." And that should immediately sound wrong to you. God became man so that man could become God. It should seem heretical, bordering on blasphemous to say that. But that's what actually happens. God lives inside of us, physically present in the Eucharist. We have donated our bodies to Christ. We hear scary stories about cases of demonic possession, but there is also such a thing as divine possession, and that happens to you every time you receive communion worthily, where God makes his home in you, and he claims us for himself. And on top of that, when we receive communion, we're not only united to Christ, but we're also united to his body, the church. Other Christians, both on earth and in heaven. And so the closest you will ever be to your loved ones, especially those who have passed away, is when you receive communion. The closest, most intimate you will ever be with your spouse is when you receive communion. That's one of the reasons we call it communion, because it puts us in union with every single member of the church, both on earth, in heaven, and those awaiting heaven and purgatory. And so that's what happens when we receive communion each and every time, not just our first communion. God makes his home in us so that he can work through you. And we need to remember that each time we receive him. We need to remember that each time we leave this church after having received communion, that we're not just taking Jesus with us, whether we feel it or not. Jesus is living in us, and he is present in this world through you.